journalism students, alumni, friends, faculty, and administration of St. Thomas University, please welcome Daniel Dale.
Thank you very much. So one of the first times I used the word lying in print was after that time the mayor of Toronto ran at me to threaten to punch me, called the cops, and then accused me of being a pedophile. How much do you remember Rob Ford? I'm curious, yes. So I've covered Donald Trump and Washington politics for 4 years now. Before that, I spent 4 years covering Toronto City Hall and Mayor Rob Ford. And it was really weird. It was a really strange experience. I think of covering Rob Ford like doing the journalism decathlon in like the Weird Mayor Olympics, because you were on the City Hall beat, and so you're covering debates about garbage pickup and property tax rates, but you're also on the crime beat because he was smoking crack and hanging out with gun traffickers. You were also on the high school sports beat because he spent a lot of his work days coaching the Don Bosco Eagles, a high school football team. You were on the health beat because every Monday morning he would weigh himself on a giant industrial scale as part of a public diet campaign, the Cut the Ways Challenge. And you were on the legal beat, the courts beat, because he kept getting embroiled in various kinds of legal dramas, one of which eventually involved me, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So there were a lot of journalistic lessons learned by all of us who covered Rob Ford. But for me, the most important one was in how journalists should approach the issue of truth. I've become known as an advocate of what I think of as a truth-centric model of political journalism. That's a kind of coverage that puts the issue of, puts the separation of fact from fiction, truth from lies, at the forefront of our coverage. And it wouldn't have happened without the Donald Trump experience I've had, and it wouldn't have happened without the Rob Ford experience, in particular, that one day near his house. So I'll pause here briefly to thank you all for coming. This is an amazingly big crowd. Every time I talk about the size of a crowd, I think of Donald Trump. So we've set a record. This is a Fredericton, a Stew all-time record. No one's ever had a bigger crowd than this. But no, seriously, thank you all for coming out. This is my first time in Fredericton, New Brunswick. I'm so excited to be here. And it's such an honor to be part of a lecture series named for Dalton Camp, who was a titan at my paper, the Toronto Star, as well as in Canada more broadly. So thank you so much, and I'll be happy to take your questions after I'm done. So I'll start with a brief intro to Rob Ford. I know Rob Ford News made it here and made it everywhere, but Rob Ford very sadly died of cancer after his mayoral term. But while he was alive, he was internationally famous or infamous for smoking crack and lying about smoking crack right up until the police discovered the video of him smoking crack. He was bombastic. He was a populist right-winger. He was mocked and scorned by much of Toronto's elite, but he also had a very devoted fan base. He engendered the loyalty of much of the city. In particular lower income communities who felt like this man was their one true champion, the one guy who stood up for the little guy, even though he was basically an elite himself, the son of a politician and a millionaire. And so there are a lot of similarities there to Donald Trump, although differences too, but a lot of similarities. One of the similarities was that the loyalty of that support base. One of the similarities was how much lying both of them did, and Trump continues to do. One of the similarities is that both of them understood that going after the media could be good politics, good political strategy in riling up their base of supporters. And so one day in 2012, Ford literally came after me. I'll give you the short version. So I got a tip that he was trying to buy a piece of parkland. And one of the first rules of reporting is that you want to go see things for yourself. You don't want to rely on sources or documents. Whenever you can, you want to see things with your own eyes. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to go and see what is it he's actually trying to buy. He was tipped off by some neighbor that there's some guy there. He came out of his house wearing a Rob Ford campaign T-shirt, and I thought even in the moment, like, this is what he'd be wearing in a dream about this. It's a Team Ford. Anyway, he accused me of spying on him, and he knew me. I'd covered him for more than a year and a half at that point, and I told him what I was doing. He didn't care. He ran at me. He demanded that I drop my phone and my voice recorder, which I did because I couldn't deke him out. He was fleet of foot. He was a former football player. And then I ran off, and I thought I was done with it, but I wasn't, because Rob Ford called the police to try to get me arrested. He accused me of doing a variety of things that I hadn't been doing, lurking, leering, being in his backyard, trespassing, taking pictures of his little kids, standing on cinder blocks to peer over his fence. And then he called the city's media to have a press conference basically on either in his lawn or in his backyard at like 11 o'clock at night, while wearing a Toronto Argonaut shirt. It was surreal and bizarre, but to accuse me of doing all those things. So the police, of course, didn't charge me. I hadn't done anything. There was no evidence that was the quote, no evidence. They'd made all this up. And I thought I was done with it then, but then it came back. A year and a half later, the mayor did an interview with Conrad Black, the former media baron turned former inmate. And Conrad Black said, what is the worst incident, something like that, what is the worst incident you've had with the media? And Rob Ford said, well, it has to be the incident with Daniel Dale. I have little kids, and when somebody's taking pictures of little kids, I don't want to say the word, but you start to wonder, what's that guy all about? And so he was, everyone knew what the word was. He was calling me a pedophile. And so eventually, against my desire, all you want to do as a reporter is cover the news. You don't want to be the news. But defamation lawyers and the Star lawyers told me this is a slam dunk defamation case. You can't let someone call you a pedophile. So I initiated a defamation suit, and the mayor issued a point-by-point apology and retraction, taking all of this back, every single part of it. And so that was a victory. But I think the most important part of that experience for me was in writing a column just before I initiated the defamation suit. The Star let me just lay out my thoughts and my thinking. I hadn't made a decision yet. And the column was headlined, Rob Ford is lying about me, and it's vile. And this moment was a kind of epiphany for me after this all settled down. Because I thought, if I can use the word lie about me, why can't I use it about other people and other stories? Like, why should I get special treatment from myself and from my own paper? Rob Ford is lying just as much about his political opponents, about various policy issues. And so why, as an objective reporter, do we have to dance around the objective truth? So I just stopped dancing around it. In the 2014 Toronto mayoral election, I started doing something I called the campaign lie detector, where I'd fact-check the mayoral debates and tally up how many false claims the various candidates made. And it was always like, Rob Ford makes 17 false claims, Olivia Chow makes 2, John Tory makes 2. There's always some vast disparity. And I thought it was important to show people that one candidate was lying more than any of the others. A lot of people like this. I got a lot of appreciation for it in Toronto, but a lot of people did not, to put it gently. Another important thing I learned covering Rob Ford was just how serious a trust crisis we in the so-called mainstream media or traditional media are facing. I think as we watch what's going on with Trump in the United States, as Canadians, one of our hobbies is feeling morally superior to Americans. And so we watch that and we're like, these people, they just believe all his lies. What's wrong with them? Having gone through the Rob Ford experience, I don't think that kind of moral superiority has been earned by us. The Star was the first paper to report on the mayor of Toronto's crack use. And it was classic traditional reporting. They went and they saw a video of the mayor smoking crack, and then they told people what they saw. Classic reporting. And what happened was that a significant percentage of people in Toronto did not believe us. The powers that be at the Star were curious about how the story was being received. Rob Ford was basically saying this was fake news. That wasn't a term he used, but he said there's no video. They're making all this up. It's a vendetta. And so the powers that be at the Star commissioned a poll of our own subscribers. And the result of the poll was that half of our subscribers did not believe that there was a video. So this was not Ford's base. These are not uneducated. These are people buying our paper and, paying the salaries of our reporters who didn't believe that it was legitimate. And so that taught me, there is a broad crisis of trust in media. People, for various reasons, are simply much more skeptical of reporters, of news outlets than they have been in the past. And so I saw that in Toronto, and I certainly see that now in Washington. So Washington. I went to Washington in 2015, and I thought that by default, it was going to be a more normal journalistic experience because, how could you possibly get weirder than the Rob Ford story? But that was incorrect. I'm wrong about a lot of things, and that's one of them. So I got there toward the waning days of the Obama administration. And what I'd heard from people who had been Canadian correspondents in Washington before was that it's difficult to be a Canadian correspondent in Washington. Not difficult in the way that it is covering, an undemocratic regime that jails reporters, or not difficult like it is going to a war zone. Of course, there are harder things, but it's hard to be useful. You have kind of your lane doing bilateral stories, covering trade negotiations, softwood lumber, Keystone XL. But when it comes to the big Washington stories of the day, it's hard to break through. The powerful power brokers are not going to return your phone calls. You don't write for their voters. They don't care about you. They're not going to give you the hot tip. You're not going to be breaking the story. Those are going to the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, CNN. And so it's hard to find a way to make your mark there. And so when I did my internal job interview, it was the managing editor and the foreign editor at the Toronto Star, and my pitch was like, I'm gonna get out of Washington, and I'm gonna ignore the president as much as I can, and I'm gonna write stories about real Americans and what's going on in the various states. And then Donald Trump came along 6 months later, and that pitch went to hell immediately. The job has been consumed by Donald Trump. I've been covering the Trump campaign from the beginning, from literally the first day. Do you remember when he came down that gold-hued escalator to Neil Young, waving with Melania? So I was there that day, and I was there because Hillary Clinton had her campaign launch in New York City, the same city, a few days earlier, and I'd planned to go to that. And I asked my editor if I could stay in New York to go to Trump's mystery event at Trump Tower, because we didn't know if he was launching his campaign. Like, we thought he might be launching another line of Trump steaks or something. And my editor was like, are you sure this might just be a PR stunt? Is it worth the time and the hotel money? And I was like, well, at very least, it's going to be funny. It'll be a funny story, if nothing else. And she's like, all right. And so I went there, and I thought his speech was funny. I thought it was funny because I thought it was an absolute disaster. He was talking about, he called Mexicans rapists famously. He was rambling about Marco Rubio sweating, about his buddy who was trying to import a boat. He was, it just seemed like, I thought it was the worst political speech I'd ever heard. And so I tweeted confidently and kind of snarkily, I said, Trump's speech could be described as off the rails if it was ever on the rails. It's like crashed in a field 2 miles from the rails. But it wasn't. It wasn't. That was completely wrong. In the minds of millions of Americans, this speech was awesome. It was exactly what they wanted to hear. And if you go back and look at it, which I have, all the themes that he became famous for, about immigration, about trade, about terrorism, they're all in there. Almost immediately, he shot to the top of the primary polls, and he stayed there. And that was far from the first time I got it wrong during that campaign. Not wrong in a way that requires correction, on the page 2 of the paper, not a factual error, but an error of assumption, of analysis, of prognostication. I think one of the important lessons for journalists of the 2016 election is humility. Not assuming that we know how voters are going to react, how an electorate's going to react, what's going to happen in the future, because things are complicated, more complicated than we sometimes know. One thing I did quickly understand was that Trump wasn't going away. He was being treated at first like this flavor of the month, like this election's Herman Cain, the pizza guy who, from the last election, he was going to rise and then fall. I went to a rally in the summer of 2015 in Richmond, Virginia, at a NASCAR track, and I talked to his supporters and saw how fervent they were. And I was like, I know these people. These are Rob Ford supporters. And so I knew right away, like, he was not fading immediately. So I covered the campaign. I traveled around the country, went to the Iowa caucuses, New Hampshire primary, South Carolina, Texas, all over, Ohio, Pennsylvania. And it was cool. Like, it's cool as a Canadian to, stand outside an evangelical bookstore in South Carolina and talk to Christian conservative voters about their votes in the Republican primary. Just interesting. It's cool. I followed Ted Cruz around for a day during the Iowa caucuses, and you can get really close at that stage of the primary. Like, you can stand a few feet from the prominent politicians in this little diner that smells of fried pickles and just listen to them. And so I thought, like, this is quaint. This is democracy in action. But as the campaign unfolded, I became more and more troubled that a lot of what I was hearing from a particular group of voters, and to be honest, it was largely Republican voters, were just not true. Everywhere I went, it felt like much of the Republican Party had been taken over by conspiracy theorists. And it wasn't just like weird-seeming people. It was like average folks. I had voter after voter tell me that they were certain that Hillary Clinton had, as First Lady and beyond, ordered the murder of dozens of her critics, like had them rolled up in carpets and buried in parks. This was frequent, honestly. I'll never forget being at a Ted Cruz event it was at a community college in rural Iowa, and there was this tiny woman, and she had written this little song chant about Cruz. It was like, Ted, he's our man, he's the man to lead this land. I was like, oh, this is so cute and quaint. I'm gonna talk to this woman after. And so I approached her after the little event, and I was like, so why do you support Ted Cruz? And she started talking about how Barack Obama was controlled by the New World Order and Agenda 21 and the world government. And it was distressing. And I grew increasingly distressed at how Donald Trump was himself lying to these people. Hillary Clinton had her own honesty issues, of course. Barack Obama wasn't always honest. I don't think any politician is. But I had never seen, and I learned no historian had ever seen, the frequency of lying that Donald Trump did, and the sheer triviality. He was constantly making things up about everything. And one good example was when he started visiting Michigan toward the end of the campaign, he would say something like, it's an honor to be back in Michigan where I had been named Michigan Man of the Year. And so I and others looked into this, and there was no such thing as Michigan Man of the Year. This was completely fabricated. But media outlets were not telling people stuff like this. Trump would give a speech, and he'd say 15, 20, 25 things that weren't true. And reporters would sometimes fact-check him on their Twitter feeds, their own account. But if you were to watch the nightly news or watch cable news, CNN, MSNBC, whatever, or you'd read the story online or in the next day's paper, it wouldn't say anywhere, one candidate in this race said 30 things yesterday that weren't true. It would be like, Trump insults Clinton with new nickname, or Trump announces immigration proposal. I made a habit of checking the front pages of the local papers in the towns where Trump would campaign, and almost invariably it would be like, Trump comes to town and speaks to excited crowd, even when he would do a speech where he would say 30 things that weren't true. And so of course it's a story if you're a small town and the potential president comes. Of course it's a story if a candidate announces an immigration proposal. But truth itself is also important. Yet it was being treated as a kind of non-story or something that was not the job of a regular reporter or regular newscast. It was something to be relegated to politifact.com or a dedicated fact checker. To me, it was central. To me, truth is not a sideshow. It's often the show. To me, it was like, if you went to buy a car and the salesman, said 20 false things to you in an hour, or you at a bar and someone trying to pick you up said 20 false things to you in an hour, that's what you would tell your friend about the experience. And so I was like, well, why isn't it one of the first things we're all saying in our news stories? And I wanted to do something to bring a specific focus to the truth or the lack thereof. So one day in September 2016, late in the campaign, I made a list of the false things Trump had said that day. Very informal, it was like a bullet point list. I just tweeted a screenshot on Twitter. And it got a big response. I think it got a couple thousand retweets. I don't know if I'd ever had a response like that. So I kept doing it for a few more days that month. And I thought I'd do it when I could, when I had time in between my actual job, or when Trump was especially dishonest. And then there was a tweet that kind of changed my life. It was from Michael Moore, the filmmaker from Bowling for Columbine, Fahrenheit 9/11, and other films. He tweeted, "This Canadian journalist every single day in the Toronto Star lists all the lies that Donald Trump spoke that day, shames the US media." And that got 11,000 retweets, and I got thousands of followers from it. And I was like, man, I have to do it every day now. So that was the first time it never occurred to me I would be doing this every day. But I have done it every day since, with the exception of the transition period between the election and the inauguration. And this has become what I'm known for, to the extent that anyone knows me. And I think there's a lesson here for aspiring journalists. I know we have some here. And it's that, even in the most crowded media environments, there are valuable niches to be filled that aren't being filled. There's some rock to look under that isn't being looked under. Maybe everyone's just staring at the rock, but not noticing it, noticing what's interesting about it. And so I always encourage people, to zig when everyone else is zagging. Find something where you can be the authority, where you can have a niche, and that'll make you useful, no matter how crowded the media environment is. People ask me what the president thinks of what I do. I honestly still don't know if he has any idea who I am. I've never spoken to him. I've been to about a dozen of his rallies, but never been up close. The closest I came to interacting with him was after what I think of as my stupidest ever fact check. I think it's actually too dumb to even be a fact check. But he tweeted something when he was still being tough on North Korea. He tweeted something like, people have been nice to Rocket Man for 25 years and it hasn't worked. So it's time for something different. And I was just standing outside waiting for my friends to pick me up for a softball game. And I was like, should I tweet that Kim Jong-un was eight years old 25 years ago? And when you have these, anyone who's on Twitter, you probably have these moments like, is this too stupid to tweet? I was like, I'm just gonna tweet it. It got like 78,000 retweets, 200,000 likes. To this day, I have no idea why. Like, what is good about this? But anyway, every day I wake up, and the first thing I do when my alarm goes off is hold my phone to my face, even before I have my glasses on, and see what the president has tweeted. Because sometimes, even if you wake up at like 7 in the morning, you're an hour behind the news because he's tweeted something at 6 in the morning. And so I did that one day. It was 2 days after I tweeted that tweet. And it said, you were blocked. You've been blocked by the president. So the president has blocked me. But it's only a minor inconvenience. You'll have a separate account that follows one person, Donald Trump, and I flip back and forth. And still every day, that's how I wake up. I hold my phone to my face and see what Trump has tweeted, see if there's anything to fact check or some other story. People ask me if we pay too much attention to Trump's tweets. I think it's possible. Maybe we could scale it back, 10% or 20%. But I'd argue that his tweets are important. They're the most unfiltered expression of his thoughts. They frequently make policy. Even when they don't, they affect people. The president's words matter. People also ask me if he's intentionally distracting us. When he's tweeting about Kanye West or something weird about Hillary Clinton, or tweeting some clip from Fox News. He's trying to distract us from the Russia investigation or something damaging. I don't think so. I think there are some exceptions, but I think for the most part, this is just how his brain works. There is no grand distraction plan. He simply distracted himself, and his tweets reflect that. But as a reporter, it's amazing how distracted he can make us, how he dictates how our day goes. I can't even tell you the number of times that I've started on some thoughtful feature article, some analytical look at some policy issue, and then Trump says something wild or fires somebody, and I have to write about that. And I think of when Trump fired James Comey. I was doing the traditional Canadian foreign correspondent day. I was with Minister Champagne, the international trade minister, at a State Department event, writing some boring thing about trade. And then he fired James Comey. And then we all bolted out of there because the day became Comey. So I'm trying to handle all these stories, be a Washington correspondent, while also trying to fact check him. I do most of the fact checking on quote unquote my own time on nights and weekends, often on Sundays. We are up to, as of Sunday, 4,625 false claims from Trump as president. That is just shy of 6 per day. It was 3 per day as of the end of 2017, so he's dramatically escalated. I think fact-checking Trump is more of a test of endurance, honestly, than a test of journalistic skill. Like, a lot of this stuff is not that hard. A lot of these claims are so obviously false that you can fact-check them with one Google search, sometimes not even that. Sometimes it requires more. But everything I'm doing is just basic journalism. Looking things up online, it's calling experts, going into databases. So for the most part, it's not that difficult. It's just tiring. And that's without complaint. This is my choice. Just fact, it's tiring because of the sheer number of false claims, but also because he is often saying the same ones over and over and over. And the first time he says that the trade deficit with China is 500 billion when it's actually between 330 and 340 billion, depending on how you count, it's cool. It's like, oh, I can bring this new piece of information to the world, tell people that the president is wrong. But when he gets to time 100, it's now 105. He said 105 times that the trade deficit with China is 500 billion. It's depressing when you get to time 94, 95, 96. I feel, though, that I can't quit, and I feel like we, more broadly as the media, can't quit. I think we should think of misinformation, political misinformation, like a kind of health virus. You can try to treat it, combat it after the fact, but it's much better for everyone if you can prevent the transmission of it. If you don't, if it gets out there without correction initially, it's really hard to get people to stop believing something that's not true. And I know this firsthand. Even my friends still refer to my incident with Ford by the Twitter hashtag that spawned that night in 2012, hashtag FenceGate. Even though my friends, of all people, know that I was never looking over Rob Ford's fence. There was no fence component to the story whatsoever. But because Ford's narrative was this guy lurking, leering over the fence, that's what stuck in people's brains. I have people complimenting me all the time, saying things like, wow, look at you, you've come, you're covering the president, you've come a long way from Rob Ford's backyard. And it's like, well, yes, but no, I've been trying to say for 6 years. He admitted I wasn't in the backyard. I had an exchange this past week with a guy who called me a weasel on Twitter. He said, yeah, it was great when Rob Ford chased that weasel, D-Dale 8, out of his backyard. And this was interesting because I tweeted to this guy, Greg, and I inserted the formal apology and retraction letter Ford had written 6 years ago. I didn't expect him to respond or expected him to just continue to be a jerk. But he responded, holy ... didn't know this, my apologies. And so, if you don't interrupt the transmission right away, it's going to stick for a long, long time. And with Trump, a lot of these lies are dangerous. Someone asked me at Professor Wong's class this afternoon, what's the worst lie from Trump? And I paused for a while because there's so many, it's hard to pick. But I'm most disturbed by two kinds of lies. One are the lies to undermine faith in democracy itself, in the US democratic system. He's talked repeatedly, including recently, about millions of people voting illegally in California. He uses this to excuse his loss in the popular vote. Sometimes he'll make it millions of illegal immigrants voting illegally in California. And I think this is really corrosive to people's faith in the democratic system. The second kind of lie that bothers me most is when he uses lies to promote negative sentiment toward particular religious or ethnic or racial groups. And I think of Muslims and Hispanics in particular. In one tweet, he combined them, when he talked about unknown Middle Easterners in the migrant caravan, which was completely made up. So that was like a double whammy, combining his two targets. During the campaign, he talked about the San Bernardino shooters, killers, and he said that people in the Muslim community had seen bombs on their floor of their home before the shooting, but they didn't report it. And he's like, Muslims have to report the problems when they see them. And so he was using a lie to try to make people think worse of an entire group. That's really disturbing to me. There are really silly ones, like the Michigan Man of the Year, like the one last week about having been in Scotland the day before the vote when it was really after. And I get called pedantic or obsessed for fact-checking things like this, but I honestly think that all of them matter. And I think the little ones can sometimes be the most revealing. I ask people to think about their own personal lives. Like we all probably lie sometimes. You're caught in something, like you didn't pick up the groceries when you're supposed to and you make up an excuse, or I don't know. You're caught in something, you're trying to excuse yourself, you're not fully honest. But I think the people we're most dubious of are the people who are lying about nothing, for no reason. And I think pointing out when Trump is doing that is valuable. So we need to interrupt the transmission. I have 6 thoughts about what we can do to try to do so. I think interrupting the transmission means, number one, that no headline should quote a politician saying something false without noting that it's false. Still today, Trump manages to get prominent news outlets, even like the Associated Press, to just quote him saying completely untrue things. They put it in their tweet, they put it in their headline. And so they're amplifying dishonesty rather than challenging it. And that's just not our job. Number two, I think it means that in every article, any news segment, whatever it is you're doing, false claims need to be challenged if they're included. And that doesn't mean being like, liar Justin Trudeau said today, or liar Andrew Scheer said today. It just means, providing the facts after, whatever false thing you're quoting them saying. I think it means, number three, not giving up after the first or second or third repetition of a dishonest talking point. I think it's important to send a message that we will not be worn into submission by a politician's repetition. As long as politicians are lying, we need to combat their lying. And if we don't, I think they win. If we point out the first and second or third time Trump says something that it's wrong, but then he does it 75 times, then time 4 through 75, he's getting that inaccurate claim to people, to voters, unchallenged. What if people didn't see this until time 4? Then they're just getting the false thing. I think it means, number 4, challenging our leaders directly for their lies, trying to hold them accountable. One of my eternal frustrations with interviews of Donald Trump is that he is almost never challenged on his lying, even when it's something that he said like 50 times. I think anyone who interviews or participates in a media scrum or gaggle with a politician needs to come armed with facts and be prepared to use them. I think it means, number 5, putting facts first. Let's not wait until a politician lies to try to explain complicated policy issues. I think part of the reason that politicians are able to get away with lies is that many of these issues are complicated and people don't understand the factual reality. And so I think we should try to be proactive rather than reactive, and don't assume that our readers have a base of knowledge about particular policy matters, whether it's the budget, whether it's a particular social program. I think there's much more of a role for explaining than traditional media have traditionally done. In 6, I think interrupting the transmission means, and I think this is the most contested part of my list among journalists, at least editors, it means using the word lie sometimes. I think that objective journalists should be allowed by their bosses to say that people are lying when they're lying, because we're in the accuracy business, and sometimes lie is the most accurate word. So I use the word false claims in all the time. Because in some cases, you don't know the politician's intent. I don't know if Trump is confused or ignorant. He just doesn't know about something. Sometimes when he gets it wrong, he's not doing it on purpose. But other times, the word is lie. Like in 2017, Trump gave this bizarrely political speech to the Boy Scout Jamboree. Does anyone remember this? He was like railing about Democrat to these little boys, and he was, a lot of Boy Scout parents were unhappy about this, and so he was questioned about it, I think at the White House. And he was like, no, the head of the Boy Scouts called me saying it was the greatest speech that was ever made to them, and they were very thankful. One of the challenges we face fact-checking Trump is that the people he lies about, especially if they're big organizations, don't want to tell us that he's lying because the president can mess up their life in many ways, so they don't want to make him mad. But I thought, what the heck, I'll email the Boy Scouts and be like, did someone say that to him? And the Boy Scouts just emailed me back and were like, no one ever said that. No one ever called him at all. And the White House was forced to admit there was no phone call. Sarah Sanders eventually said it was actually in person. Someone told him that, which also did not happen. But in that kind of case, like in any other situation, we would call that a lie, right, in your own life. So I don't understand why we should have to dance around it as objective journalists. But even though I've sort of become known as the lie guy, and people compliment me like, thank you for calling a lie a lie, I actually think that this vocabulary debate, do we call it a lie, do we call it a false claim, is secondary to the issue of whether news outlets are doing any correction at all of dishonesty. My big complaint isn't that news outlets won't say lie, it's that they won't point out to their readers and viewers in any way that politicians are deceiving them. We have a lot of complicated challenges in the media business these days. We have falling advertising. Facebook and Google are taking the money we used to have. Local papers are laying people off. City hall coverage, provincial legislative coverage, state house coverage in the US are shrinking. It's hard to solve any of these problems. But we also have a problem of eroding trust. And that's a complicated problem as well. But I think if we're going to have the public trust us, one of the things we can do is extremely easy. Be straight shooters with them. And give them the real facts and tell them in plain language when their leaders aren't being straight with them. That's not bias, that's objectivity. Now, This is not popular with a lot of people. I get a lot of hate mail. My inbox can be a really dark place. People yelling at me, calling me all sorts of names. Nothing I've ever done in journalism has so angered people as pointing out when the president is not telling the truth. Polls suggest that Donald Trump has somewhere between a 10 and 15% approval rating in Canada. I think I've heard from like 8 to 13% of those people. Like, they all email me. I was going through my hate mail archive. Actually found one from New Brunswick. A soldier based here, he identified himself as a soldier. Dave from, is it Wasis? Wasis, yeah. So that's how we signed his name. So here's a sample of the stuff I get every day, and I've bleeped out the profanity. But it's you Toronto star bleep seem to have nothing to do but pick at Donald Trump every step of the bleeping way, yet you're nowhere near as criticizing of our own bleeping idiot Trudeau. At least Donald Trump is trying to do good things for his country, while Trudeau seems to get a free pass on all of his stupidity. And this part is all capitals. The Toronto Star and all their staff should go bleep themselves, yourself included. I don't give a bleep about Donald Trump's false statements. How about Trudeau's false statement? I know there's lots of those. What's your problem, idiot? Are you afraid of criticizing your own idiot leader? Do some real bleeping journalism for a change. And he signed it, go bleep yourself, Dave from Wasis. So I get a fair bit. I've done speeches where I've read like 4 of these. People love and I love posting this hate mail on Twitter, because I think, you have to choose to find it funny as a reporter. And you're a human, of course, it's gonna bother you if someone is yelling at you. But I tend to get over it quickly. I try to look at it in a more detached, sociological manner. Don't treat it as personal, but treat it as evidence of something going on in our societies. And there's a lot of that. But in addition to the hate mail, I also get a lot of good faith, skeptical questions about what I do. And one of the ones I get most frequently is people saying, like, isn't all this useless? People will be like, thank you, appreciate what you do, but you know that Donald Trump is president. He got elected president. Facts obviously don't matter anymore. Why are you losing sleep doing this? And I disagree that it's pointless, and I think that I'm losing sleep for a good reason. Here are the 4 things I say in response to that kind of question. One, I think it's important for journalists to stand up for facts, no matter what percentage of voters want them at a given time. What is the job of a journalist in a democracy if not to provide people accurate information and to hold powerful people to account for their deception? Are we really going to let the fact that one politician got elected and has a continued base of support cause us to surrender the field of facts and let him say whatever he wants without correction? I just think it's silly. 2, you don't need to reach a lot of voters with facts to make a difference. And I think that's particularly true in the United States. The 2016 election was decided by 1% of the vote in 3 states. And so I don't think we need to convince Trump's base, or certainly not the entire US population, that he's lying or that our facts are the correct facts. If we can get factual information to 10% of people, 5% of people, even 1% of people, you can have a real impact. Third, it's not actually our job to change elections as reporters. That's just not what we do. And I ask people to think of the most famous example of investigative journalism in North America ever is Watergate, right? Woodward and Bernstein, All the President's Men, Deep Throat. Something that a lot of people don't remember is that after a bunch of Watergate scoops were published, Richard Nixon was elected in a 49-state landslide, a massive victory. And I asked people, like, did Richard Nixon's election mean that was bad or useless reporting by Woodward and Bernstein in September of that year? And no, like, our job is to inform the electorate. And it takes time sometimes for people to come to understand what we're reporting. Sometimes people never understand what we're reporting. But our job is to get people as many facts as we can, not to change any outcome. And fourth, I think that saying facts don't matter assigns too much significance to the views of Trump's base, which is by all accounts a minority of the country. We shouldn't ignore them. I think they're endlessly fascinating, the base. But we shouldn't treat them as the only real Americans. Look, like, Donald Trump lost the popular vote in the 2016 election. He's been hovering around a 40% approval rating with 50-something% disapproval. And so if your view on whether facts matter or not is dictated by the polls or who won the 2016 election, which I think is not a good way to look at it, even looking at those numbers, there's a bigger constituency for facts than not facts. And it's not just the election results. Every poll that asks people if they think Donald Trump is honest or trustworthy shows that it's in the 30s for yes, and in the 50s or 60s for no. And so it's not like Trump is deceiving the whole country. I have despairing people tell me that Trump is this master manipulator, he's pulling the wool over the eyes of everyone. I just don't think that's true. I think the evidence shows a lot of people know he's lying, and a lot of people want facts. My sense from interacting with a lot of Americans over these 4 years is that there's a huge constituency for what I'm doing. This is not only the thing I've done that's angered people the most, it's also the thing I've done that's gotten me the most compliments. There's so much, wonderful validation. I got a letter in the actual mail, a real letter, from a woman in Florida this week. She said, thanking me for giving her hope. So let's not think of the base and the base alone. But the base is interesting, and I've learned a fair bit about them from my travels and my conversations. So I've been up to about a dozen Trump rallies, maybe a few more. They're fascinating. Trump voters are very nice to me, and I think that surprises people sometimes. I think there's an element of privilege in being a white man and sort of being able to blend in there. I know talking to some of my colleagues who are African American or who are Muslim and wear the hijab, they don't always have the same experience. So I wouldn't say my experience is universal. But they've been great to deal with. They love Canadians. One of the things they say to me is like, we don't trust our media. Our media is fake news, but like you're from somewhere else, so I'm sure you're fine. So I'm like, all right, sure, talk to me. Another thing I've learned is that their group behavior, in those famous rallies can be different from their individual behavior. And I think of this one woman I interviewed at a rally in Florida late in the 2016 election. We had this lovely conversation. I forget what I interviewed about, but she was perfectly nice. And then I retreated to the media pen for the rally, and it was one of those where Trump, got everyone to turn around and shake their fists and boo us, boo the fake news. And so I saw this woman booing us at the top of her lungs, and she was right there, and I was like, hey, we just had a lovely conversation, and she gave me the shrug, like, kind of like, well, this is just what we do here, like, it's not personal. And so it's been interesting seeing how sort of this group dynamic has been different from how people might otherwise behave. I went to two Trump counties in Ohio in March of 2017. And there's kind of a cliched, Trump County story where the reporter goes to like the diner in this former mill town and talks to the regulars at Sally's Diner or Joe's Diner and asks them, so do you still like Donald Trump? And they'll be like, yes, we still like Donald Trump. And the story is like, Trump voters, stand by him. I think that kind of story is pretty boring at this point. But I went with a specific purpose. I wanted to know how voters feel about his level of honesty or dishonesty. Like, I spent all this time fact-checking, and I don't really know, what do Trump voters think? Do they think he's honest? Or do they know he's lying but not care? If that's the case, why don't they care? And so I asked people these kinds of questions. I didn't expect one of the most frequent answers I got. Several of the Trump supporters told me that they know that he lies, but they like it. They like his lying because his lies throw people like me, the elites, the media, and others, into a tizzy. This is a direct quote. I asked the owner of a clothing store, I think it was in Newark, Ohio, about one particular Trump lie about Obama spying on him during the election. And his quote was, I think Trump just did that to freak them out. They were giving him bad times, so he gave them bad times, mess with their brains. And he started laughing, and he was like, I like that, because we've had so much crap in Washington for years, and now we have someone shaking them up real good. And so if you're the Democrats, and even if you're a reporter, like, I don't know what you do with that kind of sentiment. But that's not everyone. There are other groups of Trump supporters, too. I think a larger number have told me that they do care about facts. They do want to know the truth. Some of them, though, tell me that Trump's policies are just more important to them than whether he lies. One thing I hear a lot is like, I know, he's a BSer, but he's putting conservative justices on the bench, and he stands up for Israel, and he cuts my taxes. And that's rational and fine. It's not my job as a reporter to convince people that that's wrong. They've made a rational calculation as voters. Others tell me that they believe Trump is honest, which is hard to believe. But when you press them on their media habits, you'll understand better. They'll tell you that they don't trust the mainstream media. They spend their days watching Fox News, listening to Rush Limbaugh or Mark Levin, reading Breitbart and checking Facebook groups with like Patriot in the name. And it's safe to say that none of these entities are fact-checking the president. And so no matter what we do, no matter what I do, it's not getting to these people. In the short term, I don't know how to get truth to people who have separated themselves from our traditional media world. I think peeling them away from propaganda will take some sort of sustained long-term effort to rebuild trust in fact-based, truth-based institutions. And I don't know exactly how we do it. But I think there are some things that we as individual journalists can do to help rebuild trust. I think we can be maximally transparent when we do get things wrong. Acknowledge and correct our mistakes forthrightly, using social media, the tools that we have at our disposal, and not just relying on legalistic, corrections in page 2 of the paper, for example. I think that one thing that separates us from Donald Trump, for example, is that when we get it wrong, we own up to it. And I've had people tell me when I have gotten it wrong, and I have sometimes, that they trust me more, not less, that I've told them, when it happens. I think we can be maximally transparent in how we go about our work. David Farenhold, a Pulitzer Prize winner at the Washington Post, I think is a great example of this. He will use Twitter to take readers into his work, into his efforts to get information from the Trump administration. So he'll literally post pictures of his notebook, and it'll be like, these are the 100 entities I'm trying to contact related to something about Trump's charity, or these are the 5 questions I've asked the White House today, and they've only answered one of them. And so I think if we can, open up and show people how the sausage is made, rather than just sort of dumping a final product on them, I think it increases the chances that they'll see us as, good faith human beings trying to get them truth. And one little thing I think we can do is show people that we're human. I found that even tweeting about the Raptors or tweeting about TV can be helpful in showing people, like, I'm not a fact-checking robot. I'm not I'm not the media writ large. I'm just a guy with a life and interests. I think if you can humanize yourself, it helps. But honestly, I don't know how to do it on a grand scale. I don't know how to reach the diehards en masse. I'm going to conclude by making you optimistic and then maybe depressing you a little bit. I had the honor of writing a column for the Washington Post in November about fact-checking Trump, and I ended it optimistically with the story of a man named Bruce Brown. I interviewed Bruce in 2017 during the debate about repealing Obamacare. He was a diehard Trump supporter in rural Pennsylvania who watched Fox News, listened to Rush Limbaugh. He thought Hillary Clinton, he told me, should be shot or imprisoned, so one of those kinds of supporters. But he benefited from Obamacare and didn't want Trump to touch it. So I did a phone interview with Bruce, and it was fine, it was normal. And then maybe a day later, he messaged me on Twitter to tell me, I found your fact-checking. And I was like, oh no, like, I was apprehensive. I thought he was gonna be like, you didn't tell me that you're fake news also. Instead, he was shocked and grateful. He said, this is a direct quote, wow, I kind of knew he wasn't truthful much of the time, but not to the degree of hundreds of lies in such a short period of time. Thanks for opening my eyes. And he concluded by saying, thanks again, I won't bother you anymore, but I'll be following your fact-checking of a man. As of today, I no longer can believe anything he says. I can't stand a liar. Take care. So this was encouraging to me. This was it showed me that, if you can build a level of trust, a rapport, show people that you're human, you can reach even these people who are in that kind of media bubble. And so I put this in my post column, and I put it at the end of speeches, and people clap. This is my go-to optimistic conclusion. And then Bruce messaged me again last month, and he told me, I'm still behind Trump totally and can't believe what is happening in the resistance movement of the left. And so I'm like, okay, so I meant to message him back, and I was just busy and never got around to it. And then I think this past weekend, I was like, oh, I should message Bruce. And so I went to the Twitter message box, and it said, you can no longer message this person. And I was like, oh no, did Bruce block me on Twitter for some reason? It turned out that I had blocked him, not knowing it was him, because he had been in my mentions, in my replies, spreading lies about Democrats committing mass voter fraud. And so, my quick happy ending story about getting truth and converting this man doesn't have a quick happy ending anymore. But I thought about it, and I think that's okay. The battle for truth is complicated. I think it's a long war. You're not going to convert every Bruce or even one Bruce in the short term, but I think it's incumbent on us in the media and as individual reporters to try to do the fight. Thank you very much.